Hi, I'm Thelma English. Welcome back to American Lit Session 30. This is your last video session, weekly video session. Next week, you'll be taking care of taking the exam, playing an American Lit Jeopardy game with any classmates, and if you have any seniors in your class, you'll be doing senior projects. So this will be our last video. And we'll be looking all the way into the postmodern world, the post-Christian world, and into absurdity where we stay today in 2023. I would like to share with you from the Valley of Vision. If you have printed my samples and made it into a little booklet, then this is on page 3, and I'll be sharing today. O God, thy main plan and the end of thy will is to make Christ glorious and beloved in heaven, where he is now ascended, where one day all the elect will behold his glory and love and glorify him forever. Remember, that's the primary purpose, is to glorify God. Though here I love him but a little, this may be my portion at last. In this world thou hast given me a beginning. One day it will be perfected in the realm above. Thou hast helped me to see and know Christ, though obscurely, to take him, receive him, to possess him, love him, to bless him in my heart, mouth, life. Let me study and stand for discipline and all the ways of worship out of love for Christ, and to show my thankfulness, to seek and know his will from love, to hold it in love, and daily to care for and keep this state of heart. Thou hast led me to place all my nature and happiness in oneness with Christ, in having heart and mind centered only on him, in being like him and communicating good to others. This is my heaven on earth. But I need the force, energy, impulses of thy spirit to carry me on the way to my Jerusalem, so to heaven. And he says, here it is my duty to be as Christ in this world, to do what he would do, to live as he would live, to walk in love and meekness. Then would he be known. Then would I have peace in death. In other words, he wants to imitate Christ, to have his happiness in this world. He wants to be like Christ. I hope that you have learned a little bit about that theistic vision of serving Christ first by taking this class. Let's open with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you that we can home educate and pray that you would bless this time that we have together today in Jesus' name. Amen. Valley of Vision. You can buy really cheap copies of this and get all of the poems, as I have said before. Session 30, we're looking at the post-modern, post-Christian world, the absurdity of the world, and we're going to do some exam prep today. You will have a quiz in a few minutes, and please turn in your postmodern papers now, your POMO papers. Go ahead and get those out and get those turned in. We'll be reviewing for the exam. Of course, you're ready for that exam already, aren't you? We'll be reading from O. Henry this week, who is kind of cool. Every now and then over the last 10 years, I've thought about dropping him because these were published in 1906. And then I remember stories like The Gift of the Magi and The Ransom of Red Chief. And I think, oh, that's terrible to rob kids of these. And 2 years ago, I made these read alouds primarily for one of my own grandchildren who was taking the class, because they are difficult. They talk about things that we don't even have anymore. In 1906, we're not even talking about cars usually. We're talking about wagons and things like that. So I have made read alouds of all the stories that you're reading this week. Each of these short read alouds is one of O. Henry's stories. I think you'll just love them and think they're great. And once you've listened to the read aloud one time, follow along in your book, of course, then you will enjoy these for the rest of your life. The Gift of the Magi, most of you know that story. You just don't know where it came from. The Cop and the Anthem, Springtime, a la carte, and The Green Door, and After 20 Years, and another one, the funniest one, The Ransom of Red Chief. So I think you'll get a kick out of these O. Henry stories. I sure do every time I read them. And I've done my best to make them fun for you to listen to. That's your reading this week. You're reading O. Henry. We're reading most of the book. We're reading everything that I made Thelma read alouds for. All right, let's pause the video and take our reading quiz. Okay, moving on. I found this. I don't think I had this in a slide earlier this year, did I? Alarms go off. There we go. I don't think I had this slide before this year. Let you enjoy this for a second while I pause the recording. Do you think this one's funny? I hope you don't think it's just sick and not funny. I just got such a kick out of this. Little Piglet coming to Pooh's door. Have you seen Eeyore? He's been missing for days. And with Pooh dressed up like Edgar Allan Poe, looking rather gothic here. He's got some kind of a black bird looking through his window. He's got Eeyore's tail hung up on the wall, and the floorboards are going thump, thump, thump. Had to share that one with you. Let's talk about next week's exam, session 31. Now, it's possible that your teacher sent it home with you last week to have your mom or dad proctor it, and then they sign it saying that you took it closed book, and probably make a little note about how long it took you to take that, or else you're doing that next week. And senior projects, if you have any high school seniors in your class, they'll be presenting senior projects next week. And you had an outline that's your teacher or parent gave you so that you would know it needs to be about 7 minutes long, your presentation. I prefer that you use PowerPoint rather than a bunch of books or just stand up there and talk, but you can use whatever medium your teacher has agreed to let you use. And then we have several versions of American Lit Jeopardy, and your TAs, your teacher assistants, or your parent or teacher or facilitator will be going through that this week and getting rid of questions that are too difficult, or she or he feels we didn't cover well enough, or changing point values. Anyway, the game should be tailored for your specific class. And so they're doing that this week, I'm sure. O. Henry, his real name is William Sidney Porter. You know that lots of authors take pen names. For some reason or another, they take pen names. It used to be common in the old days that a woman would take a pen name of a man so that people would buy the book, because they wouldn't buy a book written by a woman if that isn't silly. But this is his chosen pen name, O. Henry, and his real name is William Sidney Porter, but we're going to call him O. Henry. He's known for clever plot twists and the use of surprise endings in his stories. And we're going to see those this week, as well as his ability to capture the humor and the pathos of everyday life. He catches things, incredible little kids that you will find in every city, or plot twists, things that almost didn't happen but do in the end, that type of thing with surprise endings. Many of Porter's stories are set in New York City because that's where he lived, and feature working class characters just struggling to get by in the city. His stories often center on themes of love, crime, redemption. He has a lot of police stories. We're reading at least a couple of those this week. Interesting because he spent a little bit of time in prison. He spent several years in prison. So he focuses on love, crime, and redemption. And he's celebrated for his witty dialogue. You're going to love the dialogue he creates and his memorable characters. He does a great job. Porter's personal life was marked by tragedy and difficulty. He struggled with alcoholism. His wife was diagnosed with tuberculosis and then died young. They had one child, and to die of tuberculosis kind of means you cough to death. It's really a horrible lung disease, TB, which can now be cured with antibiotics. And they just had one child. In 1898, he was charged with embezzlement and he served 3 years in prison. So why did he embezzle? To get money for living expenses, because he wanted to be a writer. And he didn't want to work and write at night. He wanted to be a writer. And this is the case with several writers, not that they embezzle, but that they live very poor while they try to focus their entire work life focused on writing rather than on a separate career and doing this on the weekends. So he embezzled money. The experience influenced the themes of justice and injustice in his writing. And we're going to see that in the little short stories, The Cop and the Anthem, and then the other short story, After 20 Years, which is one of my favorites. These are great stories. Okay, this is what you're going to see on your exam. And I call these little anti-proverbs. Through the year, we've created little anti-proverbs for each of the worldviews that we've studied in depth. And you can see that each of these, it has a little pithy byword or a little pithy phrase that describes theism, for example. And each of these is worth 5 points, which is 5%. So if you miss one of these, it's half a letter grade. These are very important to be able to sum these up in just a few words. How would you sum up theism, for example? Somebody raise their hand and tell me how you're going to sum up theism. If you said to glorify God and enjoy him forever, then you said right. What about summing up deism? What would be a little proverb for deism, summing up deism? If you said trust science or trust reason, then you're correct. What about a pithy little proverb for romanticism? Yes, if you said follow your heart, that's what romanticism is, isn't it? What about realism? What's a little pithy proverb for realism? Yes, if you said life is short and then you die, then you've got realism. What about we get a let's say we get a little darker into naturalism. Yes, life is a cruel joke. What about modernism? Yes, it's anti-tradition. Whatever is traditional, they're going to do the absolute opposite. And what about postmodernity or even post-Christianity or even uh, post-Christian America? What would be the pithy anti-proverb? Absurdity, me, myself, and I, focus on me, myself, and I. Let's take a look at these all together. Theism, the correct answer would be glorify God. Let's see, apologies. There we go, I got back to that. Theism, right. It would be to glorify God, or you could say to imitate Christ. And deism, sure, trust science or reason. Romanticism, of course, follow your heart. It will never lie. And of course, we know the Bible principle is absolute opposite. And realism, life is short, then you die. Just the harsher reality. And most authors mix in realism. We kind of enjoy realism. Naturalism, life is just a cruel joke. Modernism is anti-tradition. And then postmodernity, me, myself, and I, it's all about me. You create it. It's a fictional worldview, or it would be post-Christian America, or it could be we've simply gone into absurdity. and we'll see what your teacher will accept from you. We've experienced a whole bunch of theistic writers, really good writers. William Bradford, we read a selection from Plymouth Plantation in our syllabus. Jonathan Winthrop, the Arabella Covenant, Anne Bradstreet with her poetry, Mary Rowlandson with her captivity narrative, Jonathan Edwards. We read several things from Jonathan Edwards. His conversion, we read about him. We read, you may have had for a handout, the number of things that he was going to commit to. Michael Wigglesworth, that Day of Doom poem. Frances Ellen Watkins, we printed up her poetry in a booklet. George Whitefield, the preacher. George Washington, we read his, I don't know if it was his inaugural address or his farewell address, or maybe both. Harriet Beecher Stowe, Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Martin Luther King Jr., and even T.S. Eliot after his 1925 conversion. So we read from all of these theistic writers. In fact, you can tell that we kind of concentrated on theistic writers, can't you? And I love this quote from Anne Bradstreet. If we had not winter, the spring would not be so pleasant. If we did not sometimes taste of adversity, prosperity would not be so welcome. Amazing, isn't it? Gotta love Anne Bradstreet. The deistic writers, we read Thomas Paine's Common Sense, and we read another, if you read the essay that I posted online, you read his atheist essay. We read Benjamin Franklin, his autobiography, where he told us that he became a thorough deist. It does appear that perhaps he returned to Christianity in his later years, but only God knows the heart, of course. Thomas Jefferson, we read some letters by Thomas Jefferson, letters to tell a young man how to study well, what to do in school. Mark Akenside, a very deistic poem from our syllabus. And I've got a Thomas Paine quote for you here. It's the duty of every true deist to vindicate the moral justice of God against the evils of the Bible. That's a very thorough deist, isn't it? The Romantic writers, we read Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Imitate Nothing. We read Henry David Thoreau. We read, and you made your own nature journal after Walden, Nathaniel Hawthorne, the Scarlet Letter author, but we ended up reading a short story from Nathaniel Hawthorne, Edgar Allan Poe, and Louisa May Alcott. We read from all of these Romantic writers. And I've got a quote for you. Romanticism is precisely situated neither in choice of subject nor exact truth, but in a way of feeling. And that's by Charles Baudelaire. I think it's interesting that he understands that it's not situated in truth, but in a way of feeling. It's feelings. And the problem with feelings is that feelings change, of course. The realist writers, we really enjoy realist writers. I could have put Stowe there also, Harriet Beecher Stowe, but I'm putting her in the theistic category rather, because she's realistic, but she does have some happy endings in the book. She's not quite as realist, but she is realistic. She could go here also. Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, very realist writer. Herman Melville, Bartleby, and then O. Henry is very realist. He's writing stories just of people he sees with a little bit of a twist at the end, and maybe perhaps a little happy ending of a sad story. He's got a lot of sad stories with a little bit of a happy ending, which those are really good too. And naturalism. Naturalism teaches one of the most important things in this world, There is only this life, so live wonderfully and meaningfully. Kind of hard to live wonderfully if you don't know what's going to happen when you die. Kind of hard to live meaningfully if you don't know what's going to happen when you die, isn't it? To think that you would go off to meet your creator, never having read all of the letters that all of the narratives and the letters that he has left for us at a great cost. We will never understand the cost of saving all of the narratives and the letters that we have that make up the Bible. We'll never be able to fully understand that until we get to heaven one day and can hear the story. But if there are no tears in heaven, I don't know how we appreciate that story. One of those unusual things about going into the afterlife that we simply can't understand. So the naturalist writers that we met Stephen Crane and Jack London, Ernest Hemingway, John Steinbeck. We even met Peter Singer, and T.S. Eliot goes in the category of naturalist writers, anything he wrote before his 1925 conversion. Isn't that cool? That your writing just completely changes after your conversion, which of course is true. You are responsible to know all of these authors and the titles of what they wrote. You don't have to memorize all of them, but you have to recognize them. If you see quotes that we concentrated on in class, or sections or paragraphs, you must be able to match those up with the author and then the name of the book or essay also. You need to be familiar with everything that we read this year. Okay, now that you know a little bit about Freud, I want to share something with you from the news. This was from a year ago, May 3rd, a year ago. In response to the leaked draft of the SCOTUS, Supreme Court of the United States, SCOTUS, decision to overrule Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, the President of the United States, Joe Biden, this is called a Freudian slip. When you accidentally say something that you know in your heart is true and you didn't really mean to say it. And so President Biden said, the idea that we're going to make a judgment that is going to say that no one can make the judgment to abort a child based on a decision by the Supreme Court, I think goes way overboard. So he's trying to make a case that abortion should be good. But what did he just do? This is rare, if not a first, report of a pro-abortion politician admitting that a child is aborted, not a clump of cells, not a part of a mother. He actually called the victim a child. He didn't call it women's rights, women's health care, reproductive health care, reproductive justice, reproductive freedom, the right to choose, the right to control your body, the right to make medical decisions or clumps of cells or products of conception. He actually called the baby a child. And that's a cool Freudian slip. I think I keep showing you this visual because it's very helpful. It helped me. You look at the top, and the top step, you start out with Christianity. You've got Christianity. But as soon as you undermine the Bible, as soon as you decide the Bible is not infallible, you think there is a mistake. You think, for example, that evolution is possible. God maybe used evolution. As soon as you think there's a mistake in the Bible, then the Bible's not infallible. And if there's a mistake in the Bible, excuse me. Sorry, you've had to listen to this all year. I was lecturing this morning and I've used up my voice. As soon as you decide that the Bible's not perfect, then you're messing with everything. You are looking at evolution and deciding that we're not made in man's image. We just kind of came to be. And if that's true, then there aren't really any miracles, are there? And if there aren't any miracles, there certainly is no virgin birth. And if there's no virgin birth, then Jesus is not deity. And there's no atonement. There was no original sin. So if there's no first sin, original man, if there's not an original man, who sinned for the first time, then no Adam, then there's no need for atonement. Because if there were ape people and people who were almost people, you certainly had suffering, sin, and death before Adam. And if you had suffering, sin, and death before Adam, then Adam's not the first man, and so there's no original sin, which means there's no original sin, there's no need for atonement, which means Jesus was just either a crazy guy, he was a nice guy, but he was either crazy or he was nice, but he was lying. You have to look at something like that because otherwise he's real. You have to call him a liar because he claimed deity. And so then you've agreed that there's no atonement and no resurrection. And then you become agnostic. You don't know what you think. And eventually that leads to atheism. You just don't believe in God. Vision and viewpoint become an essential aspect for the modernist writer. So it's going to turn modernist, and everything is all about your viewpoint, as you can see in this, The Scream by Edvard Munch. You can see it's all about perspective here. No longer was it okay to write just a straightforward third-person narrative. He opened the door. Or yet, worse yet, use a pointlessly intrusive narrator like Stowe, who says, well, dear reader, the way the story was told became as important as the story itself. New criticism became the dominant American critical approach in the 1940s and 1950s because that was the most suited to modernist writers like T.S. Eliot. And you could use Freudian theory, which was so exciting and new, especially its categories of id, ego, and superego. He wrote The Wasteland in 1922, that very long poem all about the waste of humanity, basically. And then a poem, The Hollow Men, written in 5 parts in 1925. Poems that really are confronting the nihilism of his generation. They don't believe in anything. They have nothing. After World War I, they come back and they're the lost generation. They have nothing. Now, The Hollow Men, we're going to be reading this poem in a minute. It's a 1925, so before he got saved, 1925 poem that explores themes of disillusionment, despair, and then the loss of identity. Coming home from World War I, people came home and they didn't come home to farms. They came home to cities, and everyone was working, and there were no farms. And so the mentally ill who had been so well taken care of at home on farms all of a sudden had nowhere to go. And the youth had nowhere to go but to wander around in the city and start getting in trouble and creating gangs and things like that. The last 100 years have completely changed America and changed American ideals as we talk about them today. So this poem explores all of that. It's divided into 5 sections, and it employs this fragmented, disjointed style to reflect that fragmented, disjointed culture that came back home after World War I. People quit going to church, people started going to movies, everybody had cars. The world just changed. The poem has many references to other literary works and cultural symbols because that's what T.S. Eliot did. It even has some references to the Lord's Prayer, Dante's Inferno, and to different saints and martyrs. And I would suggest that an annotated version works best. For T.S. Eliot, you always need annotated versions. The speaker describes a group of men who are empty and lacking in substance. In other words, they're hollow. They're hollow men, and they're unable to connect with others or find meaning in their lives. They are shape without form, shade without color, and they're haunted by this sense of isolation and alienation. As Gertrude Stein called them, they're the lost generation. The ending is famous, but I'm not going to spoil it here. Like all modernist poems, it ends with resignation to the moral decay that has changed the world, which is so sad. As the New York Times uh, writer, excuse the typo, said of the Beats in 1952, it's a spiritual problem. After World War I, there was this spiritual darkness taking over the world of writers. Their optimism had faded into one of pessimistic fatality. Coming a worldwide war, think about it. And nobody called it, they called it the Great War. No one called it World War I until we had another war, World War II. And then the Great War turned into World War I. This was a horrible circumstance for the world, that man was not getting better. Mankind, in fact, was getting worse. And the Hollow Men poem captures the mood of this post-war era. It's a search for meaning, and it has insights into human nature, the human condition outside of the parameter of the Bible. And this continues today. And it's inspired lots of other people to write lots of other poems. Now, the title says, The Hollow Men, Mr. Kurtz, he dead. And then a penny for the old guy. That's all in this secondary part of the title. Now, Kurtz is a character from a novel called The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. Dark novel, but really good. He goes into the jungle to help the natives, but he ends up living this depraved life because his heart is dark. And then the old guy, a penny for the old guy, is Guy Fawkes. That's the infamous attempt to blow up King James in 1605. I think it might be 1604. On Guy Fawkes Day in London, children parade through the streets with stuffed effigies asking for pennies so they can have fireworks to celebrate Guy Fawkes Day. So a penny for the old guy. So give the person a penny. And you remember T.S. Eliot was, he's American and he's British. And that's why we can use him in Britlit and we can use him in American Lit. So he says, Mr. Kurtz, he dead. And then a penny for the old guy. References that unless you've read those other works and know the history, you just simply don't get it. And from the first, so we'll begin the poem. We are the hollow men. We are the hollow men. We are the stuffed men, leaning together, headpiece filled with straw. Alas, our dried voices when we whisper together are quiet and meaningless as wind in dry grass, or rat's feet over broken glass in our dry cellar. Shape without form, shade without color, paralyzed force, gesture without motion. Those who have crossed with direct eyes to death's other kingdom remember us, if not all, not as lost, violent souls, but only as the hollow men, the stuffed men. Eyes I dare not meet in dreams, in death's dream kingdom. These do not appear. There the eyes are sunlit on a broken column. There is a tree swinging, and voices are in the winds singing, more distant and more solemn than a fading star. Let me be no nearer in death's dream kingdom. Let me also wear such deliberate disguises, rat's coat, crow's skin, crossed staves in a field, behaving as the wind behaves. No nearer, not that final meeting in the twilight kingdom. This is the dead land. This is cactus land. Here the stone images are raised. Here they receive the supplication of a dead man's hand under the twinkle of a fading star. It is like this in death's other kingdom, walking alone at the hour when we are trembling with tenderness, lips that would kiss form prayers to broken stone. The eyes are not here. There are no eyes here in this valley of dying stars, in this hollow valley, the broken jaw of our last kingdoms. In this last of meeting places, we grope together and avoid speech, gathered on this beach of this tumid river, sightless unless their eyes reappear as the perpetual star, multifoliate rose. And this is from the Inferno of death's twilight kingdom. the hope only of empty men. Here we go round the prickly pear, prickly pear, prickly pear. Here we go round the prickly pear at 5 o'clock in the morning. Between the idea and the reality, between the motion and the act, falls the shadow. For thine is the kingdom. Between the concept and the creation, between the emotion and the response, falls the shadow. Life is very long. That's a quote from another Joseph Conrad book called The Outcast of the Islands. Life is very long. Between the desire and the spasm, between the potency and the existence, between the essence and the descent falls the shadow. For thine is the kingdom. For thine is, life is. For thine is this is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. What do you think of that? And World War II wasn't even around the corner yet. How depressing is war? Very depressing. Okay, let's look at what another author says. And another, that was quite a violent, destructive, sad, depressing poem, wasn't it? By T.S. Eliot. Let's go back and look at Anne Bradstreet when she was 16 years old. You have a booklet of Anne Bradstreet's poetry. I don't know what kind of a cover your mom or your teacher made you. But this one is on page 8 if you printed the little sample booklet that I provided, session 1. So Anne Bradstreet, it's upon a fit of sickness, and she had smallpox. A lot of people die from smallpox. She's 16, and she's asking God to spare her life. She appears to have escaped disfigurement and other severe consequences. So, but she, at this point, when she writes this poem, she thinks she's dying. This is a poem written by a dying, or she thinks she's dying, 16-year-old girl who happens to have a theistic worldview. What is her view? What do you think? What kind of poem would you write if you were dying at age 16? This is quite a poem. Twice 10 years old, not fully told. So she's not even going to make it to 20. Since nature gave me breath, my race is run, my thread spun. Lo, here is fatal death. All men must die, and so must I. This cannot be revoked. For Adam's sake, this word God spake, when he so high provoked. Yet live I shall, this life's but small, in place of highest bliss, where I shall have all I can crave. No life is like to this. For what's this but care and strife, since first we came from womb? Our strength doth waste, our time doth haste, and then we go to the tomb. O bubble blast, how long canst last, that always art a breaking, no sooner blown but dead and gone, even as a word that's speaking. O whilst I live, this grace me give, I doing good may be, then death's arrest I shall count blessed, because it's thy decree. Bestow much cost, there's nothing lost, to make salvation sure. Oh, great's the gain, though got with pain, comes by profession pure. The race is run, the field is won, the victory's mine, I see. Forever known, thou envious foe, the foil belongs to thee. That is an incredible poem written by a 16-year-old. She says, I'll never make it to 20. You can tell she's kind of feeling like she's not going to get to live a life, but she accepts that that's the best, since that's God's decree. And she doesn't need anything to make salvation sure. And she realizes that heaven is great gain, and you don't get it without great pain. And she is suffering. She's suffering enough that she thinks she's going to die. And so she expresses her faith, that she just calls it, the victory's mine, I see. She's going to die in Christ. The victory is hers. Amazing the difference between T.S. Eliot, The Hollow Men, and then Anne Bradstreet. And I would like to think that Anne Bradstreet or one of our other authors would, one of our other theistic authors would certainly look, even at World War I, would look at that and see God working there. Amazing, isn't it? Let's talk about Robert Frost now. He's one of my favorite American poets. We don't have any evidence to believe that he became a Christian. He could have, but that we don't have any direct evidence that he became a Christian. He was born in California, but raised on a farm in northeastern United States until he was about 10 years old. So being raised on a farm until you're 10 had to be absolutely wonderful. Then he went to England. He was not making enough money selling his poetry, and he decided to go to England and see what they thought of him there, to London, I believe, and they did like him there. So he was kind of attracted by, they had new movements in poetry there, and he was more accepted, and they kind of made him famous, and then he came back home. He read an original work at the inauguration of President John F. Kennedy in 1961 that helped spark a national interest in poetry because he was fascinating. On January 20th, all inaugurations are on January 20th in Washington, D.C., in the frigid cold with ice and everything, and they all sit or stand out there in the cold. In 1961, Americans watching television or listening to the radio, because it's 1961, not everyone had a TV, or standing on the Capitol grounds, freezing themselves to death, heard these famous words. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man. And that was part of John F. Kennedy's speech when he was sworn in as the 35th President of the United States. Famous, famous words. Don't ask what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Amazing. People don't even look and think that way anymore. After the applause, Kennedy welcomed to the podium one of America's great poets, fellow New Englander Robert Frost. He was quite old by that time. He had written a poem for the inauguration called Dedication. And he went up to the microphone, but you know, these are the old days. He was blinded by the sun's glare on the snow-covered Capitol grounds, and he couldn't read the poem that he had just written, and he didn't have it memorized yet. You know, he's the glare on the paper, and he had written this poem called Dedication, and then he couldn't read it. So thinking quickly, he recited a poem that he had from memory called The Gift Outright, and that was something he had written in 1942. And he began, "The land was ours before we were the land's. She was our land more than 100 years before we were her people. She was ours in Massachusetts, in Virginia, but we were England's, still colonials possessing of what we still were unpossessed by, possessed by what we now no more possessed. Something we were withholding made us weak until we found out that it was ourselves we were withholding from our land of living, and forthwith found salvation in surrender. Such as we were, we gave ourselves outright. The deed of gift was many deeds of war. So the land vaguely realizing westward, but still unstoried, artless, unenhanced, such as she was, such as she would become." So The Gift Outright, pretty cool poem. And this is a photo of Robert Frost at Kennedy's inauguration. You can tell that he is quite an old man at this point. His popularity, you can see he only lived another couple of years. His popularity is easy to explain. He wrote of traditional farm life. He appealed to the nostalgia for the old ways. So people kind of thinking about apple picking and stone walls and fences and country roads. His approach was clear and accessible. You didn't have to have an incredible education to understand his poems. It wasn't like T.S. Eliot, where it was expected that you had read all of the famous important books and knew more than one language. He rarely employed intellectual allusions, things that, for example, T.S. Eliot was famous for, and other writers were famous for using all of these literary allusions that would escape the common man. Anybody could understand Robert Frost's poems, and his frequent use of rhyme also appealed to the general audience because remember, most of the poets during this time had kind of abandoned rhyme and they had gone for form. So E. E. Cummings, for example, would shape the words to look like something, whereas Robert Frost just liked old-fashioned rhyme. And he did it in a way that many people were unable to do. This poem, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, is in your syllabus on page 338. So we've looked at this once before this year and just feel the nostalgia here. It's in the middle of winter. And listen to the alliteration. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his furnace bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake, and the only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Isn't that a beautiful poem by Robert Frost? Excuse me, I go through lots of water, trying not to cough so much. Another poem I want to share with you, it's just called Birches, a swinger of birches. So you can see this collection is poems of Robert Frost for young people. When I see birches, these are birch trees, the ones with the white paper. We have lots of them in our neighborhood. You bend down and think you're picking up a piece of paper trash, and it's just bark from a birch tree. When I see birches bend to left and right across the lines of straighter, darker trees, I like to think some boy's been swinging them, but swinging doesn't bend them down to stay as ice storms do. Often you must have seen them loaded with ice on a sunny winter morning after a rain. They click upon themselves as the breeze rises and turn many-colored as the stir cracks and crazes their enamel. Soon the sun's warmth makes them shed crystal shells, shattering and avalanching on the snow crust, such heaps of broken glass to sweep away, you'd think the inner dome of heaven had fallen. They are dragged to the withered bracken by the load, and they seem not to break, though once they are bowed. For lo so long, they never right themselves. You may see their trunks arching in the wood years afterwards, trailing their leaves on the ground like girls on hands and knees that throw their hair before them over their heads to dry in the sun. But I was going to say, when truth broke in with all her matter of fact about the ice storm, I should prefer to have some boy bend them as he went out and in to fetch the cows. Some boy too far from town to learn baseball, whose only play was what he found himself, summer or winter, and could play alone. One by one, he subdued his father's trees by riding them down over and over again until he took the stiffness out of them, and not one but hung limp. Not one was left for him to conquer. He learned all there was to learn about not launching out too soon, and so not carrying the tree away clear to the ground. He always kept his poise to the top branches, climbing carefully with the same pains you use to fill a cup up to the brim and even above the brim. And then he flung outward, feet first, with a swish, kicking his way down through the air to the ground. So was I once myself a swinger of birches, and so I dream of going back to be. It's when I'm weary of considerations and life is too much like a pathless wood where your face burns and tickles with the cobwebs. broken across it, and one eye is weeping from a twig's having lashed across it open. I'd like to get away from earth a while and then come back to it and begin again. May no fate willfully misunderstand me and half grant what I wish and snatch me away not to return. Earth's the right place for love. I don't know where it's likely to go better. I'd like to go by climbing a birch tree and climb black branches up a snow-white trunk toward heaven till the tree could bear no more, but dipped its top and set me down again. That would be good, both going and coming back. No one could do worse than be a swinger of birches. Quite nostalgic, isn't it? You can imagine Frost as a boy swinging on these birch trees, not quite breaking them, but kind of bowing them. And he's can't go into town to play baseball, but he has to entertain himself as he comes in and out doing chores, and this is what he does. Robert Frost, buried with his wife and all but one of his children. He lived to 1973, so he was alive when I was your age. And then his wife only, let's see, she preceded him by 40 years. His children died mostly young. I think 4 of his children predeceased him. Carol Frost was his son. Carol was a boy's name too. And his son committed suicide when he was 38. Robert Frost, his mother was melancholy or depressed. And then Robert Frost was depressed most of his life. And his son Carol was also depressed. And the World War I did make people depressed. Irma Frost survived longer. Elliot Frost lived only to be about 3.5. Eleanor Bettina lived 4 days. And then he had one daughter who lived to 1995. Kind of a sad life to lose everybody. He experienced a bunch of personal hardships in his life. One of the most significant was the loss of his children. It's really, really tough to have your children die before you, to predecease you. He had 6 children and 4 of them died before he did. His son Elliot died of cholera. He was 3, and his daughter Eleanor died just a few days. She lived 4 days after birth. And then his daughter Irma went kind of crazy and had to be committed. He had all types of sad things happen in his life, and yet he was able to write poetry, live a long life, fought that depression. His daughter Marjorie died from complications of a bacterial infection after childbirth. 19th of 34, this was quite common, that you would have a child. Then, if they didn't understand about soap and water and making everything clean, and then you'd get an infection, and then that would lead to sepsis, where you'd start having organ failure, and then you would die. So, babies died and young mothers died. It was a pretty tough time. By the time I was born in 57, they were pushing everyone to have babies at the hospital. When my mother was born in 33, she was born at home in 33. And when my aunt was born in 47, she was born cesarean. And in those old days, cesarean, they cut you with a vertical incision, and then they sewed buttons on both sides and laced up those buttons to hold in all of your insides really good from the surgery. And then 10 years later, by the time I was born, everything was much more simplified. So things were dangerous and things were hard in these old days, where you would have 6 children and have 4 of them predecease you. It'd be just terrible. So he suffered not only from depression, and who knows, maybe it's depression induced by all of this close personal loss. It's hard to say. But also he had financial problems trying to survive as a writer alone and selling property to try and make money and trying to be a farmer, but he wasn't very good at farm or things like that. But that meant that he did move repeatedly because of all his issues. Another quote, by Robert Frost. I really enjoyed this one. Half the world is composed of people who have something to say and keep, and the other half who have nothing to say and keep on saying it. Isn't that a great quote? All right, this is our last review for your exam and for living. What's the anti-proverb of theism? Well, it wouldn't really be an anti-proverb were it, so pretend like the word anti isn't there. What's the proverb of theism? And that would be glorify God or imitate Christ. And theism, this is straight out of your glossary. I just reworded a little bit, but theism characterized by a focus on God, a focus on eternity, that eternal perspective. Always, that's what Anne Bradstreet had in that poem, wasn't it? She had this eternal perspective. Nature is to be tended like a garden, but not worshipped. That goes all the way back to Genesis 1:26, that Adam was set to take charge of the earth. The theist looks through nature to admire and appreciate nature's creator, God. Nature reflects God's character, his creativity, and the beauty, all the color, the plants, the seasons, the weather, the differences, all the way or all over the planet. All of those things are reflections of God's incredible character. But because the world is temporal, it doesn't achieve primary status in the hierarchy of belief. We're coming up to Earth Day, and a Christian would have a different celebration of Earth Day. It would be an appreciation of God for the Earth Day. But this is a theological worldview. All right, what's the proverb of deism? And that would be either trust science or trust reason, or both. Trust science and human reason. And what's deism all about? Deism historically produces atheism. First, you make God a landlord, then an absent landlord, then he becomes simply absent. And that is a great way to, the essence of deism. It's a belief that God created all of nature, and then he stepped back and he's no longer active in the world. So there aren't any miracles. God doesn't step into time and space anymore. This view is often illustrated as the divine watchmaker or the clockmaker theory. There's no divine revelation, so there's no Bible. And the Bible's just a book of good intentions, and Jesus is a good teacher. And this is a mechanical worldview. And of course, you know the problem of calling Jesus a good teacher. He can't be good if he said he was God and he's not. That makes him a liar or crazy. You can't make Jesus a good teacher. As with everything, even in American Lit, it all comes down to what are you going to do about Jesus? You can't live your life and pretend that he didn't live. There is more evidence for a historical, a Jesus who lived, died, and was resurrected than there is for somebody like Julius Caesar. You think Julius Caesar's famous. There is more literary evidence that Jesus died and rose from the grave than there is that Julius Caesar actually lived as a person. People who tell you otherwise are people who do not know what they are talking about. So deism, this very mechanical worldview. What are you going to do about Jesus? And they have set Jesus aside as a good person. All right, what about the anti-proverb of romanticism? Basically, follow your heart. It's never going to lie. It's opposite of what the Bible teaches. This emotional, and this is a quote from Robin Williams, who committed suicide about 10 years ago. This emotional worldview places emphasis on feelings and things of the heart. The heart provides a moral guidance. The heart provides instruction. Nature replaces God as the source of wisdom, of direction, the experiences of rapture. Instead of spiritual experience, you're looking for these rapturous feelings. And nature is the source of peace. And of course, to a tiny extent, these things are true. It is true when you go hiking or you go to the beach and sit on a rock and watch the ocean, that you do experience, it even lowers your blood pressure. But it's useless without God. And we look and we look and we think, how did God do that? What on earth gave him the idea to have the moon go around not in a perfect circle, but to have these swings that create the tides so that the ocean is always coming and going every day? Uh, where did he get all of these ideas? We're supposed to go in nature and appreciate God's character. But in Romanticism, Mother Nature or Mother Earth is deified and personified as a goddess, and reducing the human footprint is essential. That we are, as for example, Bill Gates right now wants to reduce the human population from 8 billion down to 500 million. And so a lot of people are not having kids, and that's probably a good idea. If they really feel that way, it's better they don't have kids. You guys go have kids and raise them up. Raise them up with the word and raise them up to appreciate God. But the whole idea that you need to erase your human footprint, make it lessen. What about realism? Life is short and then you die anyway. That is realistic. And we tend to like authors who are realist and Christians. That's what I like. Realism, that those writers present things as they are, including those unpleasant raw details like picking your nose or spitting or suffering or death details. All literary periods have employed realism, but the writer focused on realistic depictions ignores the possibility of miracles and divine intervention through the kindness of strangers. And usually there are no churches, or if there are churches in the story, the churches are empty. And so it's really sad because they just ignore the fact that almost every city has Christians in it. There are Christians everywhere you go. You don't have to end your story with a terrible ending because there are people who will help you. Naturalism. This is where the person has given in. Life is a cruel joke and resistance is futile. Life is just a cruel joke. And that's not a Thelma aphorism. I saw this somewhere as a chapter heading, and I don't know where. Life is a cruel joke. And then I added resistance is futile. The naturalist depicts characters as helpless, right? Because the whole earth, is against them. They're stranded in life circumstances. There's no hope of remedy. This writer feels that that's the way life is. You're locked into wherever you're born. You're locked into your fate, and fate's out to get you, and the best you can do is die well. So he sees his characters locked into this fate. And the point of view is detached, like this uninterested narrator who just recites the facts. Think of the men in a boat. Where the narrator is not even interested. It's like they're looking out a window and they don't care and they just describe it. Life is an illustration of the laws of evolution in this worldview. It's very pessimistic. Yeah, very pessimistic. It's pretty much nihilist, where you may as well kill yourself. It's a very sad, hard worldview. It's pessimistic in theme, and these poor characters are locked into fate. All right, what about modernism? Modernism is all about anti-tradition. Whatever you said we should do, that's what we're not going to do. And most of this came about in the 1960s. It's an intentional movement after World War I, and we see it a little bit in authors, but we see it in all of American culture by the 1960s. So it takes, 40 years to completely change culture. But it was this movement that expressed disillusionment with the world. These writers created a cultural revolution. They rejected all the previous norms, everything that was normal to do. It's intense introspection. It's a heightened awareness of self. It's a rejection of community. They experiment with new models of expression, including drugs. They reject God as a creator, and they seek meaning elsewhere. This is a sad, sad worldview. because they're rejecting anything that has to be that has to do with God. And the rejection of community. Think about the opposition to theism, where the theist community is everything. They make covenants with one another, they live in community, they call one another into accountability according to these covenants that they make that are expressed in the Bible. And these people, the modernists, are rejecting all community. It's all about just you and whatever you want to do with your life, do that, and it's not about other people. And of course it works better for men than women because women get left with the children when the men just leave. But they're really rejecting God as a creator, and they're seeking meaning elsewhere. But we each have just a short life to live, and if you don't have that eternal perspective like the theist does, where are you going to find your meaning? Find it and purpose. You'll find it in something for a while and then something else for a while, and you end up you're wandering your life without ever finding meaning, all because you don't want to live in community. You don't want to have somebody telling you what to do. You don't want to have a Bible that tells you that what is true in the Bible is true for all people in all times, in all places. Interesting, isn't it? The anti-proverb of postmodernism or post-Christianity, where we are today in America, would be simply me, myself, and I, or absurdity. That whatever gives you a thrill, that's what you can focus your life on. Whatever gives you purpose and meaning, you can do. These writers are influenced by the media, and this is why postmodernism, post-Christian America changes so rapidly, because it's influenced by the media, and the media is always changing. It's influenced by TV, by radio, by podcasts, by slanted news. When I was a little girl, the newscasters would try to report everything as unbiased as they could, and that's impossible now. And so you end up watching or listening to the media that you like, and so you continue to go in one direction. There are all types of documentaries showing how this works, that you watch the news you want, and then your media, say Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, then will show you more of those types of things, and you watch more of those, and you are ever moving either left or right. You're forever moving one direction. So electronic technology is their primary source of information and energy. They crave meaning by following the latest save the planet cry, and it's completely separate from science. They believe the worst case scenarios that they hear. They're very easily convinced that they are doing a good thing. They send out tweets and texts and get groups in places to break things or commit violence. They vandalize, they commit crimes, and they really believe that they're protesting. They're desperate to save the world before it's too late. And this has been progressing since the late 1970s. Okay, now that we come to the end of class, having a Christian worldview means being utterly convinced that biblical principles are not only true, but also work better in the grit and grime of the real world. What is your personal worldview? What will you be like when you leave home? What have you done about Jesus? Will you wait until you're 18 and run away from home in the middle of the night, one night, off with a boyfriend? What is your personal worldview? Are you committed to live for Christ? Are you even a Christian? Do you know what it means to repent from your sin and ask Jesus to come into your heart? Believe that he was crucified and rose from the dead, and that you can live with him forever if you accept the truth as found in the Bible. You know, how much have you read in the Bible? Have you read enough? Or do you believe people who say, oh, I've read the Bible? Yeah, they've probably read 10 sentences in the Bible. Professors all the time say, oh, I've read the Bible. No, they haven't read the Bible. They don't know anything about the Bible. Are you somebody who easily changes sides in an argument? You're easily convinced to go to the other side? Do you have principles that you live by? Do you even know what you believe? And almost all of these questions can be cured and answered by spending more time in your Bible. And yet, that is the thing that young Christians do the least, is to read their Bible and spend time in prayer, talking to the Creator, the guy who made everything. Amazing, isn't it? But what is your worldview? This is a quote from Ken Ham. Imagine if we started raising generations of children who stood uncompromisingly on the Word of God, knew how to defend the Christian faith, could answer the skeptic questions of this age, and had a fervor to share the gospel from the authority of God's Word with whomever they met. This could change the world. I think he should have just said, this would change the world. Okay, the Lord bless you. You have completed American Lit once you complete your exam, and next week it's all about your class, and you won't hear from me again in a video. The Lord bless you as you finish up American Lit. I'm very excited for you that you've done this. God bless.